Hello, we are live. It is my pleasure to introduce Saul Levene and Hen from KCL, JSOC, and Israel Society, who is also a camera fellow. We are delighted to have him and Hen Mazik here today for a session as part of UJS's Peace to Peace campaign. So without further ado, Saul.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you especially to Hen Mazik, an Israeli writer, a columnist for the Jewish Journal, and a speaker who's inspired thousands around the world with his story. He was named as one of the Allgemeiner's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in 2018 and 2021, and top 50 LGBTQ plus influencers. As the son of Mizrahi Jewish refugees from Iraq and North Africa, Berber Jews from Tunisia, Hen has a unique and important voice in today's discussions, sharing his family story as part of the 850,000 Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. As a young Israeli, Hen served in the IDF for almost 5 years as an openly gay commander. During his service as a lieutenant in the Kogat unit, he worked as an intermediary between the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, the Palestinian Authority, the UN, and many non-governmental organizations that operate in the West Bank. Hen's unit was responsible for overseeing the construction of medical facilities, schools, environmental projects, roads, water-related infrastructure, and security coordination with the Palestinian Security Forces, part of the Palestinian Authority. Hen's award-winning articles have been published in the LA Times, Newsweek, NBC News, Haaretz, The Forwards, Jewish Chronicle, International Business Times, and more. In September 2016, he began working as a freelance consultant to help pro-Israel and social justice causes. And he also volunteered as the head of the Transgender and Health Department at the National Israeli LGBTQ Task Force near Kate Center in Tel Aviv. So, Hen, you're here today to tell us a bit about the story of Mizrahi Judaism and how your family history plays into that.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak to you, Saul, and your group, and everyone that are hearing us on Facebook or online or listening later on. I think the story of Mizrahi Jews, and specifically my family story, is something that informs a lot of my activism. And I think that the reason that it's such an important story in general, but also super relevant and very, I mean, I feel like it should be centered right now in the conversation that we're having around Israel, because I think that there's a lot of misconception and misunderstanding to what Israel is, and what is the story of the Jewish people is, and where the Jewish people actually started. Of course, all Jews come from Israel, from the land of Israel, and Mizrahi Jews are Jews that, while they lived in diaspora, it was just the proximity was closer to the land of Israel, but they still lived in a diaspora in communities that were in the Middle East and North Africa. And the reason that I think that it's important is because we are talking, and here in the UK, I've moved to London about a year ago to live with my partner, and I've often run into this conversation around imperialism and colonialism, which is something that the British Empire is known for, and I think that there's a lot of conversation on how we can help communities decolonize, or how we can fight against imperialism, and how imperialism is actually a negative thing, which it is in the sense that in the things that it does to communities around the world. But I feel like the conversation around Israel is that people accuse Israel of being an imperial power, or that it's a colony of some other country. And I think that's really important to, before we have in the conversation, to remember that when we're talking about imperialism, the best way to recognize an empire, or the test that scholars and experts would tell you to use when you want to identify an empire is language, because empires use language to promote their imperial homogeny and control over other areas when they colonize other areas, and then they force the local population to speak the language of the empire. That's why I speak English, because English was promoted through colonizing other lands, the same way that French is being spoken in so many countries. It's not because those countries decided to adopt French, it's because of French colonialism. The same with Spanish, and the same with Arabic. Arabic is also an imperial language that was promoted through colonialism throughout the Middle East, as part of the Arab aspiration of Arab Empire and Pan-Arabism that we see today with the dozens of Arab countries in the Middle East. So that's really important to clarify. And once you recognize the language, you can go back to the empire that really is the source of this that is the source of the colonialism that is in question. When we're talking about Israel, we need to understand that there isn't any motherland from which Israel was created. The Jews don't have anywhere else to go back to. And in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's often, I think also it's something that between Israelis and Palestinians, we're still missing this point that when the Jews were fighting off British imperialism in the land of Israel, we were trying to get the intruders out of our land. The Jews have nowhere else to go, so fighting the Jewish community from our land in the land of Israel is not going to make us, go anywhere else. And I often get those comments on Twitter. People tell me to go to Poland or go back to Poland, and I'm always puzzled because I've never been to Poland, and none of my family members have been to Poland. And that is a good segue for my family story. My family came to Israel in the early 50s. My family from my mother's side came to Israel from Iraq, and my family from my father's side came to Israel from Tunisia, as you said. They were part of ancient communities. The Jewish community and the Jewish story has started in the East. We all come from the East. We are people of the East, and the Jew. I said that Jews started in Israel, in the land of Israel. But we know today in Israel, that was the geographic location where the Jewish people have started. And I think it's important also to understand indigeneity, because this is another term that is being used a lot. Indigenous people, what is to be indigenous? And to be indigenous to a land, every people are indigenous to a land. But to be indigenous to a land doesn't mean where your grandparents are from or where your great-grandparents are from, because if that was the definition, then white Christian Americans would be indigenous to North America, and we know that is not the case. Being indigenous means where you started as people. So where the land where your culture started. And again, language is a very powerful tool to examine that. It's where your language that is being spoken today has started from. And Hebrew, of course, started in the land of Israel. There's archaeological findings that support that. And the Jewish people, as indigenous people, we're not just indigenous to the land of Israel, we're also indigenous people as part of indigenous peoples in general. And you are indigenous as long as you maintain the connection to the land of your ancestors. So the Jewish community is maintaining this connection. The way that we're doing it is by praying towards Jerusalem 3 times a day. It's by when we're smashing the glass in a wedding to remember Jerusalem, when we're or even indigenous practices like taking the 4 plants in 4 species of plants in Sukkot and waving them to 6 directions of the wind. This is indigenous practice. Or when we invite spirits to our home. And I think often we don't even realize that we're inviting spirits to our homes every Friday when we sing and welcome the angels of peace into our houses and ask them to bless us. This is indigenous people's practices. Or to keep a seat for Elijah, the prophet, on Passover. This is part of indigenous people's practices. So we're seeing it as religion in this modern terms, but this is part of why all of this and many of the commandments that we are following today are all related to the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And that's, if you look at Shema Yisrael, one of the most important prayers in Judaism, half of it is about how we're going to practice our Jewish lives in the land of Israel. So that's important to start with, understanding that indigeneity is just where you start. And people, it doesn't mean that if one people are indigenous to one area, other people can't be indigenous to this area as well. It's important to say. And indigeneity is not something that you use to fight other people or fight other communities or trying to erase other people's identities. It's not what you do. It's not what indigenous people do. Indigenous people are often very welcoming. We saw it in what we know today is America, that when the settlers came to America, the indigenous communities there were very welcoming. And I think that's what the Jewish community has been doing. And that's what Zionism is also all about. It's about welcoming others and creating a country that, as we see it today, while it's not perfect, still welcoming to other minorities that are not Jewish. So it was important to also discuss that. And I'm getting now to the story of my family. But it's just important because I feel like there's so much misunderstanding and ideas that are being spread out there, and misconception about what those terms mean. So it's just important to clear that out. So even though my family lived in lands that are very close to the land of Israel, for them, they still lived in a diaspora, and they lived under Arab rule. I was always fascinated by that. My grandmother, my Iraqi grandmother, she's very proud of her Iraqi identity. She calls herself Babylonian Jew. That's many Iraqi Jews will say that they are actually Babylonian Jews, and they would identify as that and not as Iraqis, but they would be very proud of their Iraqi culture and their Iraqi identity. It's interesting that they would prefer Babylonian Jews because they've been there since this land was known as Babylon. They've been there before there was Iraq, and before there was Arab invaders that came and controlled this area and colonized it and turned it into what we know today as Iraq. And actually, at one point, Baghdad was the capital of Iraq, had majority of Jews living there. And I think that's really telling about this very strong and rich heritage of the Jewish community from Iraq. But what's interesting is that my grandmother never described herself as an Arab, and I always found that I said, okay, we're speaking Arabic at home. We spoke Iraqi Arabic, Iraqi Judeo-Arabic. There's some terms that are very unique for Jews in Iraq that you can recognize. Often I would speak to to Arabs that are Iraqis, and they would say, "Oh, you're actually using this term that is that the Jews of Iraq used to use it." So it's a very specific. I guess it's like if Yiddish was developed in Europe, so I guess there was also an Iraqi Arabic that was developed in Iraq, Iraqi Jewish Arabic. But my grandmother really resisted the term or always said that they are not Arabs. And the more I studied the history of my family and started to dive into what happened to them, I realized that it's not that they didn't want it to be Arabs. That was the greatest thing you can be in Iraq, because if you were an Arab, you had equal rights. My grandmother talked when I grew up and I asked her questions. She said that Iraq was amazing, that she had such great relationship with her neighbors, and I said, but okay, but you left. Why did you leave if it was so great? And I realized that great means having such discriminatory laws to anyone that wasn't an Arab, that they were proud of being dhimmi. Dhimmi means a protected minority. They were proud of this title because they felt that they were actually protected, but they didn't realize that their conscience was so colonized in the sense that they thought that they were actually being favored by the Iraqi ruler when they tell them that they can't ride a horse, or they can't build a building that is higher of a Muslim building or a Muslim owner next nearby, that the synagogues had to be lower than the mosques, that they couldn't testify at court, that if a Jewish woman was raped, the victim would be blamed for what she did. They were discriminated in every area of life, and this, I think really it's really sad to see that they didn't realize that this was discriminatory. And I think things started to get worse and worse for them, especially during World War II, where several Nazi agents came from Europe to the Middle East. And that's also important to recognize that the Holocaust was not limited to Europe, that the Nazis wanted to kill all Jews everywhere. Of course, we cannot compare, and we're not doing any comparison between the horrific genocide that took place in Europe to the violence that Nazis incited against Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, but it's all part of the same story, I think. And in 1941, there was really, everything changed for the Jewish community in Iraq. And if you ask them, they will tell you that as well. And again, it's this community is so where most of the halacha that we're following today and the Jewish text that we're following today, all of this was developed in Babylon, in Iraq. There's Babylonian Talmud was developed there. Maimonides actually immigrated there because he realized that this is the center of Jewish thought and thought leadership in that time. So it's a very strong community that did not want to leave. But in 1941, they were reminded not only of their place, but also that they're not welcomed, where in 1941, in June 1st and 2nd, during the holiday of Shavuot, one of the the holiest, one of the holiest holidays for Jewish people. 2 days of violent dispositions took place against the Jews of Baghdad. During this time, tens of thousands of Iraqi Jews were injured, hundreds were killed. What we know today is the Farhud. Farhud is in Arabic, it means violent disposition, violent attacks against the local community, specifically the Jewish community in this case. And while it was incited by Nazis from Europe, it was actually, or Nazis from Germany, it was actually conducted by Arabs in Iraq. And that was really the time my grandmother told me horrific stories about how she saw her best friend being a teenage disabled Jewish girl being raped in the streets and just killed after that, or how she saw a Jewish mother and her 9 kids in the street being shot by an Iraqi police officer one by one, and leaving the mother to cry and only then killing her. Really horrific things that my grandmother saw. And that was really the reminder that their time is limited in Iraq. And in 1951, the Iraqi government passed a bill that allows the Jewish community to give up their citizenship. And that was unheard of, that a country will say you can give up your citizenship. That's in any case, it would sound crazy and racist and discriminatory, but it was actually a blessing for the Jews of Iraq, because they wanted to escape. Their life had been miserable after the Farhud and after those events, and they knew that if they want to escape, their faith is not guaranteed and it's not safe. And yeah, they took this offer immediately, and this invitation to leave, and they packed whatever they could and went to the airport. Of course, most of their belongings were taken from them. They were allowed 1 suitcase per family, so they took everything that was important for them. All the gold that they have, or every money that they have on them, was taken from them, and their passport were stamped all over, never to return. And that was the end of thousands of years of Jewish history. And they traveled to Israel. No other country would take them back then. They were refugees with no land and nowhere else to go to. But they were refugees that left one place that they never considered to be their home and came back to a place that they thought it was their home. And I think that's part of why it's so challenging for people to recognize that you can actually victimize and attack a whole community of people and make them refugees, even if they're returning home. And everything was taken from them. The only thing that they had was their culture and their the food and the recipes that they brought with them, the language. But even that is now being questioned by, I'm reading online very often that people say, it's Israeli food is actually stolen from Arab countries, and it's not even laughable. It's just really sad that they took everything from us, and now they're trying to take the last thing that we have, that is our culture and our food. And of course they're doing it because if they're saying that we have no culture, we have no right to exist, and we're not really a people. And I understand all this mindset that this is part of the trauma that my grandmother carries with her from living in Iraq. There was 150,000 Jews living in Iraq until 1940, and then today I think there's 1 or 2 Jews still alive in hiding. I think there were reports that the last one actually passed away, but or left, or was there was one Iraqi Jew that actually there was some crazy story about him and his not giving a get to his wife. Anyway, challenging, like very weird story, but there was, the fact is that almost 150,000 people were forced to leave and not being able to take anything with them, and that's really the definition of ethnic cleansing, to push a whole ethnic group out of their land. I think other than maybe the Armenians and now the Kurds that are trying to fight for their national homeland, the Jewish community is one of the only communities that were able to go back to their homeland and rebuild it and reclaim their indigenous homeland and language. And there are other religious minorities in the Middle East that are fighting for that. And I think when I'm hearing people saying, well, actually Mizrahi Jews should be called Arab Jews, and that's really doesn't sit well with me, because of course historically it's wrong and it's false, but also it's, try and go to Copts in Egypt and tell them they're Arabs. They would not like that at all, or Yazidis or Amazigh people or Maronite Christians. Like, none of them will take this identification, because they know that they're not Arabs and they know that they've been subjected to oppression by the Arab Empire. So that's really important that we understand that. And when we're speaking about Mizrahi Jews, I think the reason that I use Mizrahi Jew rather than Sephardi, because we know that there's this distinction between Sephardi tradition and Jewish and Ashkenazi tradition. Ashkenazi Jewish tradition is one that was developed in Europe, and also Sephardi tradition by and large was developed. Sephard means Spain, so a lot of it was developed in Spain. But I think that people that identify as Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews, and everyone can identify as whatever they want to, but the Sephardi identification is very specific for religious identification. So for me, it's the Mizrahi identification. Mizrach means east, and Mizrahi means a person of the east. I find it more relevant because it encapsulates more than just religious traditions. That it encapsulate the culture that we have and the language that we have that is very distinctive from. I mentioned Yiddish or Ladino, which are different languages that were developed in different areas. It's not going to say in any way that Mizrahi Jews have stronger connection or are more indigenous to the land of Israel. As I said before, we all lived in diaspora. Mizrahi Jews are just I guess in a sense the fact or the evidence that Jews stayed in the Middle East, and some of us, we had such a long diaspora. Some of us moved to Europe. Some of us moved to the Amazons, even all over the world. We've been scattered, but we are where we started is Israel. And Mizrahi Jews, even though they were closer to Israel, they still were by and large banned from going back to the land of Israel. And while all of this was happening to my family from my mother's side, my family from my father's side faced very similar fate, where a community of 105,000 Jews were also almost completely ethnically cleansed from their land. Out of this 105,000 Jews, there were 3,000 Amazigh Jews. Amazigh are the tribal people of North Africa. There's interesting folklore on, a Jewish Amazigh warrior princess named Daya that was actually fighting against the Islamic expansion to North Africa, and many Muslim scholars were referring to her as Jewish Amazigh or Jewish Berber queen that was fighting. And the term Berber is something that Amazigh people these days are rejecting because it's coming from it has a barbarian connotation to the term. But the fact is that Jews and Berbers were Jews and Amazigh people, were very close to one another. And 3,000 Amazigh people were actually Jewish. And some historians argue that they were the descendants of this Amazigh queen, or that they were converted to Judaism. It's still unclear, but there's still not enough study around this, and I think that's another issue that we're not. The reason that we don't know much about it is because it hasn't been studied enough and discussed enough, and I just hope that the stories would be discussed more. But my father and his grandparents and his parents and his brothers and sisters. He has 15 brothers and sisters, a very big family. Came to Israel also in the early 50s from Tunisia, and I think that I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, their story is very similar to the story of the Iraqi Jewish community. Oh, sorry, I remember what I wanted to say. There was discriminatory laws against the Jews of Tunisia, and it all, of course, during the Holocaust, the Vichy Nazi regime, the French Vichy regime that was led by Nazis, was taking over North Africa, and then my grandparents had to work in a forced labor camp in Tunisia, and they were due to be sent to Europe to death camps, and they survived that at the end, because a few days before they were supposed to be sent, the war was over. But I think that it's really connecting to what I said earlier, that the story of the Holocaust didn't just happen to Jews in Europe. It was supposed to happen to all Jews. And after the war was over, they thought that things would be better, but the Tunisian government started imposing discriminatory laws, which banned any Jewish associations and banned Jewish sports associations. And later on, also the Rabbinical Council was dismantled in Tunisia, and the Tunisian Jewish quarter was destroyed completely in 1957. All of this was part of this systemic attempt to push the Jews of Tunisia out of their land. All of the story of how they arrived to Israel and how they came as refugees is not to say that we need to weaponize it, or to say this is what happened to them, then the Palestinians, what happened to the Palestinians when during the War of Independence in Israel is it's land swap or something like that. And I think it's very important to make that clear, because I see sometimes people are making this argument, and we shouldn't, because there's no comparison. There was almost 1 million Jewish refugees that lost everything they had and were forced out from the Middle East and North Africa. The land that they lost is equal to 5 times the size of the land of Israel today. So 5 times the size of the land of Israel today. If you put it together, that's the amount of land that was taken from us. The property that was taken from us, I think in Iraq alone, it's about $300 billion, what it's worth today. The life that we're taking, my great-grandfather that was killed in Iraq, there are so much that we will never be able to get compensated for, and I don't think we should hold it in front of the story of the Palestinians. Which, while it's, again, we need to be. Personally, I support a two-state solution, and I think the Palestinians do deserve national rights if that's what they aspire to for. But I don't think that it has anything to do with the story, and we need to just make space for the story of the Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, because that's part of it, the whole story of the Middle East. And if you really want to understand the Middle East, you have to recognize this community. And when I'm asking my grandmother what justice is for her and how she wants to, what will mean, does she want her land back, or she wants to go back to her home? I wish I could go back to see where my family lived, or where my family was, where my grandmother lived. But I know that where they lived is completely destroyed now, and we can't really go to see that. And I know that for her, she says that justice is acknowledgement, and justice would mean that people would know what happened to them, and that people would do something to make sure that that the stories are not forgotten. I think my grandmother and my family just don't want to be forgotten, and that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing today, and that's why I actually wrote a book about this that is coming out at the end of this year. Follow me on social media and learn more about that. But I said in the beginning, it informs everything that I do, because I really think that, and I posted that recently, that being Jewish and alive is a miracle, but I don't think that it needs to be a miracle. It shouldn't have been a miracle for my grandparents, but it is, and it is for me, and it is for us. So that's why I continue doing the work that I do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. That was really fascinating to hear that lens of Jewish experience. We're going to open up for questions. I'm going to fire off the first one, but if people want to ask something, please comment below, and then we'll call on you, and then you can ask Hen yourself. But I'm really interested that you mentioned indigeneity in the first sort of part of your talk. And you define it as a sort of as a cultural birth of a people. So with this lens, how do we understand Palestinian indigeneity? Because on the one hand, they are Arab peoples, but they sort of came with self-determination, with the state of Israel, with the whole lens of Zionism. So we do need to bear that in mind, right? Like, did they have a right to the land? You mentioned you support a two-state solution. How does this factor into the discussion?
Well, I mean, I would be very careful to not identify other people. Indigenous people are it's a self-identification. Like if a community identifies indigenous, that's something that we need to recognize. So I'll be careful not to tell Palestinians what they are and what they're not, in the same way that I hope that people would not tell Jewish people what we are and what we aren't. But I will say that if you look at the UN definition of indigeneity, and if you look at actually the UN definition of indigeneity is not the best one to identify Palestinians as indigenous. But if you look at the idea that, you know, it's where your people started as people, and if you have distinctive culture that is unique to you and a language that is unique to you, so then you can be identify as indigenous to a land. And I think that in many ways the Palestinians do factor those demands, not demands, those criteria are fulfilled by Palestinian identity and Palestinian people. I think that I mentioned that the UN definition is not working, because in the UN definition, it's like this. They're saying that this identity has to be distinctive to, or they have to be living under imperial rule, and Israel is not an empire, so it really doesn't hold water in this sense. But and I mean, there is arguments to be made about Palestinian identity that is inherently connected to Arab identity, and that's an imperial identity. But then again, they're living. Palestinians are still living under Arab empire and are still suffering from inequality in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, wherever Palestinians live in the Arab world. They are treated as a second-class citizen. So in a sense, maybe it is, you know, it's while they are inherently connected to Arab identity, they're still being oppressed by the empire. So it's a very interesting conversation. I would just, again, be very careful to not tell other people identify specifically, because indigeneity is such a it's a self-identification, and it's a community. They need to be the ones that are saying if they are or not. So yeah,
that is really interesting, important to bear in mind. I mentioned that sort of they have their roots in Arab culture, as opposed to, say, there are arguments online which go about that Palestinians are the true Canaanites. They're the real indigenous people, and Jews usurp them. That does that factor into the conversation a little bit? Does that sort of like help a little bit?
If Palestinians were speaking Canaanite language and maintain Canaanite practices, its indigeneity is not defined by like DNA or by it's around culture and around it's an agrarian type of connection that you have with the land. If you don't have it, it means that you're not indigenous. And in this sense also, you know, when people ask me, well, can Jews not become not indigenous or become, you know, not be defined as indigenous? There is a case that actually Jews can become not indigenous people, and that's when Jews are that's when some Jews are saying that they're anti-Zionist or that they're anti-Israel. In this case, they are becoming they're becoming non-indigenous people, and then they're losing their indigenous rights to or claim to a land when they cut off this connection. So that's the only way that you can lose your indigenous connection. And in regards to how, and that's another thing that people will say, well, you know, but what about Jewish people that converted to Judaism or married into Judaism? So I think that's another thing, that if you look at Native American communities and you're looking at mixed marriage between Native people and American and white Americans, they're coming into the tribe, and while they don't get recognition by the American government as Native Americans, they do get the recognition by the tribe, and they're being treated as part of the tribe completely, and they have the same rights by the tribe. So that's also the answer on that. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Oh, cool. So with regards to conversion, it's purely defined by culture and acceptance, as opposed to anything to do with DNA or ethnicity. Okay, yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, Emmy, do you want to turn your camera on and ask a question yourself? I can do it too, but it'd be nicer to see your face.
I'm on my computer and my camera isn't working, although I can switch to my phone, but I have to log out and log in again. So I can do that. So I'll just do that. 1 second. Sorry.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question in the meantime? Okay, maybe, oh, okay. Ethan Oswang, do you want to turn your camera on?
Hi. I have a question about starting these conversations in universities. So when Jews are constantly being told that our, sorry, I need to like read the word, indigeneity doesn't count or doesn't matter. And we're told that by sometimes non-Jews, sometimes other Jews. How do we start the conversation, or how do we enter that landscape when that idea is presented to us or cast upon us?
So you mean that what type of arguments do you hear that, you know, that it's not relevant, or?
Well, I guess like there's a couple Jewish students at my drama school who say, you know, like Jews aren't like we don't have a right to claim indigeneity and have a right to return, as well as some who denounce their indigeneity as anti-Zionists. How do we? How should I enter that conversation? Like, because it is a very difficult one to approach and can be quite daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear what you're saying, and I think that the first thing that is really important to remember is that, and I said that Jews, it's not only Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, it's Jews are indigenous people, and every people are indigenous. Like, that's something that we need to recognize. And if the people that you're speaking with are saying that, you know, you can ask them if they're anti-imperialism, and if they're you know, they think that we need to decolonize areas and recognize the indigenous communities of an area. So then we also have to speak about the Jewish community's indigenous roots. And I think another important thing is that often, and that's what I'm hearing from what you're saying, is that often those people are also anti-Zionist, and they don't think Israel should exist, and they don't think that Jews have right to live in the land of Israel. So where do we have a right to exist? Where should we go back to? Because I mean, I can, while many of them are sending me to Poland, I can go to Poland. I can't live there, and a lot of us don't really have option. And I think that's, you know, that's why the Mizrahi Jewish story is also important to remind people that majority of Jews in Israel today, over 55% of Israeli Jews, are Jews that are descendants of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We can't apply for citizenship in Iraq or in Tunisia or in Morocco or wherever it is, even if we wanted to. In some of those countries, in Iraq or in Libya, we can't even go visit or see where our families came from. And you know, that's why I always ask anti-Zionist Jews, like, if, you know, where do you think Jews should go to next time a country turns on us? And that, you know, and it sounds also like those people are very privileged. They are, I mean, they are privileged because they can be anti-Zionist. Most Jews don't have this privilege. Most Jews in Israel don't have this privilege because we can't be anti-Zionist, because Zionism is just means that I'm going to live, that my family will live. Like, without Zionism, we would all be dead. So I think that's another important thing. So just discussing privilege, discussing white fragility, and discussing the ideas that if you want to be anti-imperialist and you want to support decolonizing areas and standing up for indigenous people, you have to recognize that Jews are indigenous. And if you don't think that they have the right to live in Israel, just tell us where should we go? Where should we live? I still haven't gotten anyone to give me an answer that will be satisfying to this question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could we get the spotlight on Emmy, please?
My question is because many Arab countries outside the Gulf area have a non-Arab past, and some still have minorities, non-Jewish minorities, like the Christians in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, and the Amazigh communities in North Africa. Could they influence the relations with Israel, and possibly maybe one day reject the Arab identity that they have, that's the main identity in those countries? And if that's possible, could that happen anytime soon? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's very optimistic and believing in miracles. But I think, was it Ben Gurion said that you have to believe in miracles in the Middle East in order to be a realist. So I think, it's very ambitious, and I wish that was the case. I do find that many Amazigh voices online are open to this conversation. I see that many Kurdish activists online are supporting Israel actually and open to this conversation. Also, Armenians are also supportive of this. Israel is a successful story of land back for indigenous people, and those indigenous minorities. I hope that we'd be smart enough to work together and unite. I think that Israel and Israeli leaders have been very focused on appeasing the West for far too long. And I mean, I get that, like, we get security support from the West, but I think we need to also keep our eyes to the East and have, and I know that there's peace agreements, which are nice now, in order to create a coalition to stand up to Iran that wants to turn the whole Middle East into whatever. But I think it will be in our best interest, so as indigenous religious minority communities in the Middle East, to come together and to stand up together. Do I see it happening soon? It's just a question of I think Jews in Israel need to recognize that we are not part of the West, that we are not part of Europe. Often we look up to Europe, and we just want to be accepted so much, which is when I don't think we will ever be accepted. And I don't think we need to be accepted, because we're not Europe and we're not part of the West. And we are a country in the Middle East with Middle Eastern people that have, our own culture, and we can trade and have connection with the West, and we should definitely keep our strategic allyship with America. But we should be interested in our own neighborhood and that's but I get it that there's so much economical and political issues that behind it. So if I see it happening in the next, I don't know, 10 years, maybe not, but I hope that in a generation or two, like, it will change.
Can I add a follow-up question?
Yes, of course.
So you said Israel is not, well, shouldn't be part of the West, but could you argue we are a bridge between the East and the West? Because we're not exactly an Eastern Islamic nation either. We have a more kind of Western society, I would say. Not European, but I guess it's a bit in between, or it's a mix.
Yeah, I don't think that being an open society and an equal society makes you Western. I think that's part of imperialism, colonialism, that made us think that if the way that Israel behaves, it must be part of the West. But I don't think it is. I think it's part of the East. And I think also Islamic states that we see today shouldn't be like the representation of the Middle East. It's unfortunately is that, and we know that we need to also stand up for those that suffer under them. But yeah, I agree. I think in a way it can be like this bridge between the West and the East. But for far too long, we try to only appease the West, and that's my issue. That I don't think we need to. I mean, I understand the support and everything, but I also see it as the West profits from animosity between minorities in the Middle East. There are many actors that profit from that. So yeah, I hope for peace, inshallah, one day with all of those minorities. Yeah.
Does anyone have another question before we finish? Okay, I would like to ask a follow-up question based on sort of that theme, but then we really will stop. I've heard Israel described as a Western state with Jewish decorations. Do you think this is fair or accurate?
It's a cute description. I draw my definition or the way that I see Israel from one of my heroes, Jewish leader, Natan Sharansky. He wrote in his book that half of the world has just identity and the other half has just freedom, and that Israel is trying to balance between identity and freedom. And I think that's really such an accurate and brilliant description of what Israel is, because listen, I as a gay man in Israel that is Jewish and yet Iraqi and Tunisian and has all this mixture of identities that is secular and living with a non-Jewish Western man from England, I wouldn't be tolerated anywhere else in the Middle East, to say the least, for any of the given reasons that I gave. And yet I'm feeling safe, and I feel like I have a place to go to, and we have a safety net for Jews from all over the world. I don't think that it should be an halachic state. I don't think that we need Israel to turn anything more or less than what it is today. I think we just need to improve it. There's a lot of areas that we need to change and make it better. But I think we're doing a decent job. The fact that this country has been around for just a little more than 70 years, and it's still a refuge for Jews escaping violence anywhere. I mean, we're seeing it now with Ukraine, where Jews are finding refuge in Israel, where I don't know how many countries open their gates for Ukrainian refugees, and how many refugees did they take in, and how many countries actually fought against Ukraine or against Russia or stopped the attacks or did anything. I mean, the war is still going on, and if anything, I think it's a reminder for Jews all over the world that not much has changed, and the world is not going to stand up for other countries unless they have interest to do that, economic or power or whatever it is that leads them. And to depend on anyone else other than ourselves is not a wise strategy. It's one that has failed us. And I think that that's what makes Israel the most, like, that's why Israel is not just Jewish decoration. It's the essence is Jewish, and the essence is the idea that, I mean, that's what Zionism is. It's the promise that we will be protected and that we don't need to live in the mercy of anyone else. And one last thing, I'm asking most of my friends in Tel Aviv, they all will describe themselves as secular. And then you ask them about the way they live their life. So they would, every Friday they will have Kiddush, they will keep kosher, they will fast on Yom Kippur, they will celebrate all the holidays. They'll even go to the shul to pray, but they describe themselves as secular. That was part of, what Jabotinsky was writing about, how while he was secular and did not believe in God, he was keeping all the mitzvahs and he was doing all the prayers and doing everything that he could to maintain his Jewish identity, because he said, as long as we're living outside of the state of Israel, this is the way to maintain Jewish identity. That's what indigenous people do when they live in the diaspora. They maintain their identity by practicing religion. And I think that now in Israel, we don't even realize how flourishing Judaism is, but it's flourishing and it's everywhere, and it's the only place in the world where you don't have to run. I mean, I live in London and I have to chase religion, and I have to find a place to do Kiddush, and I have to find out when the holiday is, because if not, I will miss it. And I realize how privileged we are in Israel to not have to do that, because that it's Passover, because all the supermarkets are going to stop selling chametz and bread, and that it's Yom Kippur because cars will not drive during the day, and all the stuff that we take for granted. Living in the diaspora gives me a new perspective on that. So I love Israel in this sense, and I think it really represents the dream of the early Zionists of what a Jewish state should look like and be like.
That's really interesting. I'm so glad that you added that extra part before I cut you off, because it seemed as if you were describing Jewish identity within the state as sort of as by Jewish right of return. But you don't see it as a sort of theocratic thing. You see it as like a these Jewish practices are what define us as a cultural people, and that permeates the people of Israel, and that creates a Jewish culture that's more than just Jewish trappings. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the culture itself is in the diaspora, you see it as you know, you can look at it and say, well, Israel is not really, like, they're not really Jewish and it's just Jewish decoration around it. But no, that's the soul of it. That's the essence. And for us in the diaspora to look at it from outside, it's hard to see it sometimes because we need to really, like, for us, being Jewish is much more than just waking up in the morning and going down the street and going to the supermarket and coming back home. But that's Jewish for Israelis, like, no matter what they do. I mean, of course, there's communities that are more, that maintain their culturalism. And that's a whole conversation about multiculturalism in Israel that I think is preserved in such a perfect way, where there are communities that can preserve their language and their culture and their identity that is separate from the Jewish one and Israeli one. But yeah, going back to it, like, everyday life in Israel is filled with Jewish identity, and everyday life in London is amazing, and I love it, and I love hanging out, but it's not Jewish. I have to make an effort for that, and I think that's what Israelis are privileged in this sense, that they don't have to fight for Jewish identity. It's there.
Thanks, you really clarified that for me. All right, thank you so much for joining us today and taking our questions, and we hope to have you back again sometime, maybe in the near future. I don't know, who knows, but
maybe next time.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming, and hopefully this recording will be online for anyone to peruse. All right, all the best. Bye then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.